All right, welcome to the Parallax Podcast. With me today are Raven, Connolly, and Max Borders. Welcome, guys, back to the podcast. How are you doing?
Great.
Doing very well. Thank you, sir.
So, the Between Two Worlds Symposium in London in September. That's your thing, huh?
It is.
Yeah.
And it's kind of risky, seems like. It's either great timing or really, really poor timing.
Why is that?
Well, as you know, Britain is in a very odd, British people are in a very odd predicament right now.
Oh, you wanted to go straight in? I had this for minute 40, you know.
Oh, really? Did you? Yeah. Okay. Well,
But
we
you
can
go
wait if you want.
But just go ahead.
Well,
I wanted to ease the people in, into, I wanted to loop it up a little bit, but, go.
Nice.
Go ahead.
Well, no, it is a strange time. There are some dynamics on the ground in the UK everybody's aware of because of the news. It has to do with sort of the spit and sawdust original Brits and the Yobs, who are expressing consternation and displeasure about immigration, and the immigrants are a strong minority that wants to sort of counter demonstrate, and this has been brewing since I was in grad school in London myself, at UCL. I remember hearing tales of these sorts of skirmishes, conflicts, and just general acrimony between camps. It's been going on for a long time. And as more and more immigrants have come into Britain, there's been more and more of these conflicts. I'm not Douglas Murray or Keir Starmer. So I won't weigh in on this because I don't feel it's my place. It's not my country, and I don't have the subtleties of being on the ground. But what I will say is that Britain has been going headfirst into becoming increasingly illiberal surveillance state, both surveillance and censorship. And that is, they are, in a manner of speaking, a canary in the coal mine for other countries. Perhaps the one you're in, certainly the one I'm in. Censorship and surveillance has been going on in the US for a while. It's getting more extreme. And so a few things have happened lately that justify this network of censors, and the surveillance state persists. So there are powerful corporations, NGOs, and government officials that are networked around the world, and their purpose is to shore up this centralized authority. And for a liberal like me, that is of utmost concern, because there could be a point beyond which there is no return. So as a decentralist, as someone who's interested in decentralization, and Raven, who shares some of those sympathies, we've decided to do an event on sort of the culture and spirituality of decentralization, and that's the Betweenworlds program. Raven's Betweenworlds title really speaks to this idea that we are at this liminal stage of development, between two epochs, you might say. And when she said Betweenworlds, I was like, that's it. That's really what we're going for here. But what is the next world? And all of us together have a choice. We can either accept this dystopian, centralized, more authoritarian future, or a more decentralized, locally empowered future that is pluralistic, to be sure, but considerably freer and less surveilled and censored.
Right. I mean, we shouldn't go too deeply into politics. I mean, I would like to, but I'm also not a citizen of the UK. I have a good friend actually there who lives there and with whom I'm trying to, find out what's actually going on there. It's also, an economic problem.
Mhm.
Then, of course, you mentioned these people, this right-wing conservatives, Charles Murray. I was just reading up on Curtis Yarvin and, the Dark Enlightenment. There are some ideas that are quite interesting. The idea of the cathedral, for example, this complex out of media and
Mhm.
university that kind of are the gatekeepers of truth and what we receive on information and ideology. But then again, I think I was reading up on the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and I don't know how familiar you are with biopolitics and the idea of the state kind of encroaching on personal liberties out of a goodwill, basically, and that goes on since the dawn of democracy in a kind of way. And so I kind of try to have like a distance and complex picture without delving into left-wing or right-wing politics per se, because it's like there's the superficial interpretation of things that you see with Charles Murray, and then there is a whole underbelly of deeper sociological processes that have to also be taken into account. I
I
don't
do
think
I
yeah
do
mhm.
think Charles Murray's an interesting cat. We could talk about him if you wanted, but I was referring to Douglas Murray, the British fellow. Charles Murray is an American. I think if um
Charles, who's Charles? Who's Douglas? I mean, the gay guy from Britain. Who's
yeah,
that?
that's Douglas
Right.
Murray. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um but I understand what you mean, and this is a deeply sensitive for Raven and me as we were thinking about doing this, because we wanted to present a more cosmopolitan case for decentralization and local empowerment that um, that doesn't step on people's toes, particularly at a time when they're going to be super sensitive about issues on the ground.
Right.
So I agree with you about sort of keeping a distance. And yet there is something you said there that is really interesting, Tom. And that is this left-right dichotomy is really kind of an illusion. And the spectacle of left-right electoral politics and elections really masks this orthogonal axis that is liberal to authoritarian. And while that is a political stance, it is one that is less recognized because left and right can both be authoritarian. And it seems that left and right in the UK, in the EU, and in the US all are trending authoritarian. And it doesn't matter whether it's left or right. Now, of course, the lefties are going to say, "Oh, it's these awful, right-wing populists." And of course, the right-wing folks are going to say, "Oh, it's these left-wing socialists." And they're both right. So this adoption of the various illiberal doctrines is scary, and we want to present the idea that no matter what your conception of the good, in a community sense, we want to be drawn to others who share more resources or are more market oriented or what have you on the economic front, or socially more conservative, traditional family and church and all that stuff versus we want to live a strange lifestyle, poly or what have you. Whatever your cup of tea, it is possible to create these cultural niches peacefully, and that lies at the heart of liberalism. And we really want to, bring what Raven. I'll let Raven speak to this, but something that is transgressive in the sense of authorities who think they know what's best for you. A transgressive message to London without stepping into the current political moment too much.
I mean, sorry, but just to interject this and then goes to Raven. But, you know, like when we go back 100 years and we talk about the roaring 20s of the 20th century, you know, it's like we have all these movie-like images of big parties and nude people and whatnot. But I would rather guess that these were these pockets that appeared in a increasingly oppressive time. You know, people were oppressed by economic issues, the rise of fascism, and that was what the Roaring Twenties and the 30s were about. This was not a big party, but there were like these little pockets and niches where new thoughts and new ideas and movies and art and you know, philosophy could arise, but it was not, you know, big dancing in the streets, so to speak.
Well, the red shirts and the brown shirts were fighting each other in the
Right.
streets during the 20s, all the while. But and these movements were compressing these pockets of possibility of art and culture and party,
Right.
you know, 20s flapper parties as well. So I think that's a really good point. We hope that this is one of those moments. So that's a really good analogy, because it seems like Britain is becoming increasingly illiberal, and there is a looming shadow over the country, as well as over my own, I have to say.
I mean, just
Yeah.
people got, sorry, Raven, go ahead.
Just figured that, I would just like to speak into that, because I think in all of these countries, there are these pockets of people who, kind of like you were describing, Tom, there is an understanding of like the mainstream political tensions and conflicts between various cultural groups, and also historical events and traumas that have shaped the conflicts that are happening. But there's also a cultural layer, I think, that's attempting to have some amount of distance from that flow in order to experiment with emerging structures, with different ways of organizing, with a creative engagement with some form of new world. And that's also where the between worlds idea comes from. It's like, what are these ideas, like something like decentralization? What I really like about that term is it bridges between a political philosophy and a structure, a way of actually organizing things in the manifest world. But it also is a future crafting concept that creates a way of thinking, or a sense of spirit, or a sense of the belief structures of a group of people. So it holds a position both in the present as a tangible form of organization, but also as kind of a hyperstitional entity that calls us to create it from a spiritual place. And that way you have more than just a political ideology. You also have a process, a philosophy, and even maybe a mystical engagement with something that also has a practical level. And that to me is also what Between Worlds is about, because the new world has yet to really form itself fully. And so we are sensing into abstractions, things that are not yet tangible, and decentralization is one of them. But I think that there's a complex, you know, like co-creation is another, or seduction, or this idea of you know, opting in or being part of a consent-based order, where you are drawn into something because you want to create it, not because it's being forced upon you. There are these ideas that exist within these emerging communities that are searching for the manifestation. And then there's also the bridging between technology and where, you know, you can create an opt-in community in the digital, and you can organize based on bottom-up collective principles, co-creative principles. So bridging technology, and then also just the spiritual level, the cultural level, and the manifest physical reality level. So these are also between worlds. Like, how can we link these things together to create more of a emergent whole around these dissociated parts?
Great. Yeah, I mean, the thing that always is interesting to me is that in order to create something new, the old categories or terms, or, you know, all this has to, you know, not deconstruct, but dissolve in a kind of way. I don't know what right and left means nowadays. It's like, I can give you historical analysis of what that has meant, but what it means now, I have no understanding. But in a certain way, it is important that these concepts break down and dissolve in order for something else to emerge. And you need these pockets for that something can emerge.
Absolutely.
I not put on your microphone, Max.
In my country, it's my team versus your team. Go team.
Yeah, it's very basic.
You mean the right with its left?
The right-left distinction is increasingly bizarre, and so many things have switched in the last 20 years. Have migrated. Planks and platforms have migrated, such that, they're curious and unrecognizable, which is exactly why this liberal versus illiberal axis is to me far more important, and yet people are still playing team sports. So
Right.
much so right now in the American election, and the Brits just got through their election in which they voted in the Labour Party. But one got the sense it was not because of the successes of Labour, because of the failures of the Conservatives, and they're largely indistinguishable in most respects. Corporate capture, surveillance, manipulation, and control. These are features of both parties in Britain, and it's like you don't have this is a false choice.
Right.
And if people start to understand that, then they can ask, what's next then? If these are a false choice, what other choices do I have? And it would seem like one has none in my country and in Britain, but hopefully we can excite people about those alternatives. And as Raven hinted at, start to steep them in this spiritual and cultural dimension that begins to make it less about systems and structures and also about experiences and feeling, so that these are married as a gestalt.
Right. So this was like more or less the context, because I mean the symposium itself is not overtly political as far as I understand. So I mean, so just tell us about something, about the symposium. What do you want to do? How it's structured? I saw that Alexander Barth will come. So what's your plan? What are you doing?
You want to take that one, Raven?
Well, the initial inspiration for the event was to have an in-person congregation for the Great Robes. And then we got together to create the content. Like, okay, what speaks into the moment? What's a way of, lighting a torch so that people who have a similar sensibility can actually find us and join into this global network that can operate both in a virtual and in a physical plane. So decentralization is such a powerful term. It's recognizable to people outside of these very niche subcultures, but is also super relevant to people in these niches. And therefore, we wanted to have that be kind of one of the attractors of the event. But I think the event is going to be more than that. And it's more than just a conference. We're also going to be experimenting with ceremonial performance. So these exhibitions.
Yeah, read that. What is that? What you're planning to do there?
Well, I don't want to give it all away.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not going to tell you everything at all. But the Grey Robes is inspired by the Masonic tradition. It's inspired by mystical tradition.
Right, because London has a rich history of Freemasonry and Golden Dawn and everything, so that's a perfect place to do this.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
It's perfect for that reason. And also in these traditions, right, there's this going back into the ancient archetypology and fusing it with the present. So another layer of the Betweenworlds concept is invoking these ancient archetypes and marrying it with digital spirituality and finding, okay, when we bring these things together, what emerges. And we're attempting to bring that into people, not merely through the logos, but also through the mythos, through ceremony, and through a symbolic language, and not merely like a visual language of text or something like two-dimensional, but actually an embodied experience where the symbolism is in the gesture, it's in the physical orientation of people in the space, and it's about where the view is, where the subjectivity is being directed. So we're getting into this place of experiencing the congregation and what you can do when people are brought together with a form of intention that is both, tangible, but also goes up into spirit as well. And we will have musicians there. Owen Cox is going to be playing with Microcosmos. Yeah, which is going to be amazing. So that's going to be live guitars and percussion. And we'll have some actors from Dark Renaissance that are going to join us. So we're taking the invitation of the Grey Robes into both the logos and into the mythos. And I think that will create a much more engaging experience for everyone there, and help them to see that this isn't just a project of the mind, but it's also a project of the heart and of the spirit.
Yeah, well, and also I would presume a cultural project, because, I mean, you alluded to this, it is basically a ritual. As soon as you start to work with symbols and work with language and work with ideas, and you create a hub for, certain actions, then you create a ritual. Like you announce values that will determine your behavior henceforth. And I always like these kind of things, the rites of Elysis, the ancient rites, beneath the in the catacombs, where that took place after the carnival of the city kind of was over, and the initiates came into the catacombs and were not allowed to talk about what was going on in there, but it was a secret kind of ritual happening also again in these kinds of pockets. I'm always fascinated with these kinds of workings and rituals, basically.
Well, and it's interesting that you the last time we talked, Tom, you really took me to task about what is the Grey Robes and what is its goals. And I mentioned at that time that the primary mission is that of decentralization. But decentralization, as seen through the eyes of the network state Balaji Srinivasan types, or someone like the Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin, is going to be a really left brain, logos heavy way of looking at things.
Right.
We want to marry that with a cultural, a spiritual, and artistic vision that makes a complete, not just doctrine, but sense of the experience of being a Grey Robe. And so all of these are experiments towards that end. Whether and to what extent they will work, we cannot say, because it's you got to promote it, and then you've got to execute, and then you got to follow through afterwards, and that's all very hard. But no good thing that is carried out in the world is easy. And so Raven and I are just decided to give it a shot, to do our first experiment. And London became out of both pragmatism and the sort of situational awareness around, as you say, the Freemasons, but also the current circumstances, as it becomes more Orwellian, as if Orwell had seen into the future. We thought this is the time, a good time to sort of get in there with this vision and say, let's wake up to this possibility that may be curious or unfamiliar to you, but it is a different way of looking at life that circumstances and power has for you. And couched in this Grey Robe secret society shtick And in some sense, it is a shtick, but in some sense, it's very real. We reify it together in solidarity. If that happens, that'll be great. If it doesn't, we gave it our best.
Well, I think there's a misconception, about what a ritual actually is, because lots of people go to, to the church or think about a ritual and think there is a specific outcome that has to happen. But, if you look at it, from a strangely systems theoretic approach, it's like you instantiate an algorithm or generator function and you bring it into the world, and then you go on and and it's like the end result is not fixed. It's not the end. In a kind of way, it sounds somewhat esoteric, but the idea is to create an algorithm with that has some form of autopoiesis that regenerates and grows in a kind of way, and that is what a ritual is.
And replicates itself.
Yeah, that's what I meant with autopoiesis, that replicates and instantiates new values, basically. And then society can decide if it wants to adopt these values or not, but the algorithm at least is out there, so.
Yeah, it's funny because the other day I was writing a piece and I was presented with a paradox, and I wrote the paradox out first. But it was very clear to me that the duality needed to be reconciled. And what I was responding to a man who wrote an article about why we should love liberalism, the good old original, straight from Britain, liberalism. And while I appreciate it very deeply, it still has it's still very sort of stuck in the Enlightenment. So how do you bring it out of the Enlightenment as a doctrine that can animate people? Besides the stuff that we've been talking about, that Raven and I have been talking about spiritual and cultural, having it as a doctrine nested within that a little better. There was this paradox to me was liberalism needs to be both more radical and more traditional. And how can both of those things be possible? Well, in the sense of it needs to be more radical, we need to be getting rid of this sort of bankrupt notion of representative democracy. Because as a system that's continuously, people figure out how to game it, corrupt it, and there's regression. And I think we're all living in societies where sort of the democratic republic is seeing its better days as a system. Then there is, more traditional. And you think about how, take any tradition that's still going, whether it's the Zoroastrian tradition that Bard favors, or the Jews who are sitting at the Seder table saying next year in Jerusalem, or Manishtana Halila Chazah, why should this night be different from any other night? Language. They've said that for thousands of years, and they will continue to say it. That self-replicating memeplex of what it means to be a Jew, connected through time and space over different countries, different languages, and so on, by this ceremony, by this ritual every year of Passover, or the Zoroastrian prayer before the fire. Those things allow for continuity and coherence. And so we constantly have to iterate new rituals in order to get that. So there's novelty in the event, but then it is subsumed by process, to use the Bard language. And so that's what we're experimenting with. And seeing it in the abstract, seeing it philosophically is one thing, but instantiating it, making it a thing in the real world is quite another. And it's not easy.
It's also a question of truth, isn't it? Because like what arts produces is in a kind of way like an instantiating of truth. You have, everybody laughed about this, but you have the Taylor Swiftification of US politics now with Kamala Harris. It's like who was nobody or even frowned upon. And then you have the cathedral, making this kind of person out of her. Nobody know who she is. it's like from the outside view, it's hilarious, but I mean, everybody knows it's a lie. And even on Colbert, I don't know if you have seen it, people are laughing about the notion that CNN is a, institution that
Neutral
reports the
arbiter.
truth. Yeah. So the audience, I don't know if you've seen it. So the audience is actually laughing when Stephen Colbert is talking about this. And so there's no truth in that anymore.
Right.
So how do you get to truth? So
Yeah.
it's like, it's like through performative art, basically, so about ritual, about maybe you, Raven, can say something about this.
Yeah, I mean,
I got you.
I like where you're going with this a lot. I think this is something that inspires on the performance level for me, on the cultural level, and also on the mystical level, because you have to have some abstract notion of truth, right? Like that it's because it is almost always emerging, especially when you're thinking about cultural or social truth, which is such a, what does it mean to be civilized? What does it mean to be a culture? What does it mean to confront, the material conditions of your time? And
what does it mean to be authentic?
Yeah, what is any of that? Right. And there's very different notions of let's say, authenticity, right? Like, I think the American notion of authenticity is very different than the Swedish one, for example, when I live now in Sweden. So there's a lot of different ways that people engage with these concepts and ideas. And the places of synthesis, the places where there's a little membrane, that's built, and you can come inside and the rules of engagement are different. I think those types of spaces become the forge, where cultural tensions and, existing energy can be released and moved into some new state. I think this is also, I get inspiration from the kind of concept of metamodernism in this sense, where you can go meta and you can mediate, and I think that this is a crucial part of what it means to be civilized, or to even produce a culture as such, is to interact with the energy like of tension in your culture, to work to release it in special containers if you can't do it in the public arena, which for many of the tensions we have today, we cannot do it in public, or else, you'll be like swarmed by one of these autopoetic kind of algorithms. And
Raven, it's funny that to me that sounds, it's metamodern, but it's also Hegelian. Insofar as I understand Hegel, which is not very well. Thank goodness we have Bard and Tom, right, in our corners to correct us. But it is, in a manner of speaking, a sublation container.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. Yeah. And from there, like, there's something really palpable about cultural tension, right? And since I've traveled more in the world, I've been able to detect this, where you can walk in a city or a place and you can feel the zeitgeist and see how it puts pressure on you in different places and moves you around, and the contours of kind of social recognition and status, and how to just survive, how to take advantage of situations, what kind of personalities are favored, how you look and how that feeds into things, right? These things are what we've been built to pick up as human beings, as social beings. And of course, I think as an artist or someone who's called to actually find the truth in this virtual space, there's a necessity to be in environments where you can go into the transgressive, the places where in society it would be low status or unrecognizable or illegible to actually express those things openly and engage with them. And from there, once you can get into a container of people that are willing to go there, are self-contained or, self-aware enough, where they can see, their own ugliness, they can see their own refraction of this collective tension, and engage with it directly, I think that's where you release and you can move into new levels. You can move into new forms of synthesis and expression, right? And
especially if you have a group of people around you who are, by virtue of being with you, giving you permission to do so as well.
That's crucial. You
So
can't
you're
do
not
this.
alone.
I don't think you can do this alone. I think this gets into the idea that Brian Eno came up with genius, the genius of a collective, of a group. And I think that's very important for the type of virtual overload that we're dealing with in this hyper-connected world of 8 billion people. We need a collective intelligence to genuinely engage with this superstructure. And artists, we need more than just, and I think this is the Grey Road Project, we need more than just builders, we need more than just artists, we need more than just philosophers and mystics in their own little corners. We need to bring them together into the same scenius, so that there is this cross-pollination of viewpoint and there is tension between different forms of approach. And from there, we can kind of experiment in this forge, right, of a crucible of something. Because I think the challenge is to maintain some sense of faith that there is some aliveness in the human spirit. There is some capacity to create new structure, create new ways of being, even if you don't know what that may be in the present, right? So I think people who are able to hold that sense of uncertainty and continue to have faith without necessarily getting tangible results immediately is a really important characteristic, of this group.
I want to unpack this idea of truth a little bit. This is another perhaps Enlightenment pitfall of liberal doctrine. But Tom, you said something about the idea that that if we just lie enough about it and put on this spectacle, it'll become a reality. And this sort of comes from American bastardization of postmodernism, okay, where all reality is socially constructed. So to speak of truth is to speak of my truth, or of some sort of intersubjective notion of small t truth. And this has become, I know that there are a lot better postmodern thinkers out there than what the Americans did to postmodernism. Nevertheless, here we are. The critical theorist and the postmodernist left in the United States essentially destroyed truth in a sense, in that, and it gave them a justification to lie and to use violence and mendacity for political ends, and think that they're good in doing so. And so what you have right now is yes, exactly. Nobody liked Kamala Harris. Everybody thinks she's an idiot. Everybody knows she's an idiot. And in actual reality, in a correspondence theory of truth, she probably is, right? She's not some kind of genius. She's very lucky, or she may be savvy politically and backbiting or climbing up the bureaucratic hierarchy, or whatever she did with Willie Brown in San Francisco. But we know that she's not this wonder person that the media is suddenly making her out to be.
Overnight, basically. Overnight,
yeah. And everybody except those who want her to be that, they just desire it, are enormously skeptical. I think one thing that good old analytic American philosophy brings to the table would be this notion of at least a coherence theory of truth and knowledge. Okay. And what's interesting about decentralizing media is that this centralized media apparatus that is, you call the cathedral after Yarvin, also Jordan Hall calls it the Blue Church. There's a great article called Understanding the Blue Church that I would encourage your listeners to check out. But what's interesting about human beings is that we have this ability. I would say philosophically, we have this epistemic means of a coherence theory of truth and knowledge, which is to say, it's sort of baked into us to take premises and hold them in juxtaposition to see if they form a coherent picture. We may not have some rigorous access to the outer world, the truth as it is out there in the world, but we certainly have a very strong instinct for coherence.
Right.
And what is happening is the more batshit the political types get with this sort of postmodern sensibility about just architecting truth as if it were social reality. If we just say that Kamala Harris is brilliant and is going to lead the way to the promised land, it will become that reality. I think a lot of people, if that happens, are going to be very disappointed in her ineptitude and her incompetence. But I'm not here to do political today. I'm just pointing out something about she is either dumb or she's a midwit or she's not, right? Or she's a genius. There is a truth out there in the world around that, and we have to use coherence to make that decision. And what is interesting with the increasing decentralization of media, even in the age of censorship and in the age of surveillance, we have the ability more and more to network with people in order to sniff out bullshit. And it's compressing the time to sniff out the bullshit as we become better, faster, cheaper at decentralizing communications, decentralizing media. And the indie media is becoming a mighty, mighty force in this. It may not win an election this year, and to what extent it wins elections in the future, I don't know that I care, because as a system, I think this has outlived its usefulness, democracy as such. But it can allow us to become more conscientious and unified in our fragmentation. We become more in love with pluralism, the peaceful side of pluralism, not the acrimonious side. That is super promising to me, and that is another message I think we can show in that. It's like, you guys are part of a subversive group of people who are truth seekers that are outside the censorship industrial complex. And we're very happy to have you, whether or not we disagree about whether we live in some social system that taxes at 50% or 25%. That's really not the point. The point is that we can carve out such niches and experiment with them in a patchwork if we are able to either circumvent or underthrow, as I like to say, these authorities who want to shove the one true way down our throats.
That's interesting, because you mentioned to experiment, because, when I look at what you're doing and, the idea of the symposium, that's very much in, the tryout for an experiment, because, obviously you never can find coherence. The world is way too complex for this. You can never know everything. You can never, bridge the gulf, from into American politics. There's too much of a Grand Canyon between us as, receptors or, observers of the whole thing, and the inner working of, let's say, the DNC with their programs, whatnot. So but as a hub, as a pocket, as a niche, you can, and I like this, you can try as if you could do it. And
Yes.
and you can do it collectively through the as if, and you can create an experiment when you're open enough to create a coherent worldview or a coherent algorithm to create a new perspective for the world. But I think it's important to know that it's basically impossible to actually know, but you can act as if you get a coherent picture.
Well, there are some interesting projects out in the world where they're starting to these instantiations of models are being experimented with. Prospera in Honduras, for example. We can point to through the 20th century examples. Dubai. Dubai isn't any kind of purist experiment, but is a very successful one. In 30 years, they went from a kind of a 30,000 people, basically in the desert bordering the sea, to one of the most splendid and wealthy places on the planet in 30 years. That's not nothing. Now, one might argue that Dubai is just like a big shopping mall that's not terribly interesting, and that might also be true. But just in terms of standards of living and so on, they've done a good job. Same with Singapore. Same with Hong Kong earlier in the century. I mean, these are Liechtenstein is ancient, but it is one of these pockets that's sort of like, okay, what are they doing? What's interesting about that? And the more of these kinds of experiments we have, we may find these local experiments, these very small, many are going to fail, but failure is local and cheap rather than system-wide and catastrophic. When it's a presidential administration or a super state bureaucracy like the EU that wants to implement something system-wide, and if the failure is system-wide, it will be catastrophic. It will be complete over the whole system. Whereas if you try these things in local niches, possibilities may emerge, and it's like, okay, we can sustain this. And that's the difference between what Raven was describing as bottom-up versus top-down. That's not to say that with this, we wouldn't want to create an empire of the mind, where an empire of the mind is more and more people with our way of thinking. But our way of thinking only weds you to a first-order liberalism. Your individual local niche may be far more socialist, maybe far more religious-oriented, or what have you. It could be, an intentional community where resources are shared. But you don't expect that to be an imperial doctrine. You expect it to be a local one where your niche of possibility is working and attracting people. That's a very different. It's this going back to the beauty of pluralism versus monomania.
I mean, Raven said something about seniors, and I always loved that. I always loved, the idea that if you look at a given epoch, from our past, there were always like kind of small pockets of people, doing incredible stuff. I mean, think of, the relationship between, the emergence of postmodernity and the Wiener Psychological Association, right? And turn of the century. And, what happened in Paris in the 20s with in painting and literature with Hemingway and James Joyce, and you had Picasso, Gertrude Stein, and Dali, and all kind of, tiny little groups of people. And you find that in every epoch. It's very interesting, and they kind of act as a, agent to propel certain ideas forward. But, if you look into it, these were not coherent groups. They were people with widely different ideas in terms of what they were thinking and what they were doing. I mean, Freud and Adler and Reich and Jung, these were not best friends, but they were wrestling with something, and they didn't know what it was. They came together in order to find out what it was, because society is constantly moving and shifting, and we are forced to realign ourselves. And then these people come together in these pockets and try to find something and try to formulate something through ritual, through science, through music, through painting, whatever, that, in retrospect kind of defines what the emerging epoch or episteme or whatever worldview was about, basically. So I always find that very interesting. How did it came about? How did these people found themselves and created what they did?
Well, and that happened for liberalism in Britain. It just turned out to be a rather pure philosophical play that was trapped in logos. And I think what Raven and I are trying to do is test the theory that liberalism can enjoy a renaissance.
Right.
If it is coupled with a deeper sense of morality, spirituality, and culture. But that it's very difficult to say. It's too early to say, but these are the kind of experiments we have to make in order to find out. And honestly, Alexander Bard has been of the mind that the decentralist movement up to this point, coming out of crypto or sort of American libertarianism, is way too autistic. And he's right. It is way too autistic. It's way too left brain. It's way too sort of logical, and in some sense it lacks empathy. To steep it in the empathic, in the not just something that's more experiential or sensory, or even contact with the sublime. It's funny because there's a guy in London, as a matter of fact. I think his name is Carhart Harris. Is that his name, Raven? The guy who's done all the experiments with psychedelics out of Imperial College. In any case, I don't want to fail to, or I don't want to get his name wrong, but he's done really great work. And what he finds is that people who use psychedelics are finding an at least long temporary, if not permanent, shift in their orientation. Most notably away from authoritarian sensibilities to the more liberal sensibilities, more openness, more patience, more sense of connectedness with other human beings that are different. And holding this pluralism and unity in juxtaposition is what makes this kind of message really hard. Because most people that we're trying to reach out to don't hold things in juxtaposition like this. They function based on either talking points or team sports or just unidimensional issues or unidimensional ideology. And what we want to do is say, yeah, but that we have this doctrine that allows us to balance our various conceptions of the good by instantiating locally empowered communities to do different things and experiment with different modes of living. Man, that shit is straight out of John Stuart Mill. But Mill just was a left brain philosopher. If you actually start to do that, and you can do it more with art, culture, and even religion, that's interesting. This is what pluralism looks like, and we can live together in peace. And Britain is at a time where their pluralism is not peaceful, because you have to be wedded to first order pluralism if you're going to have a more cosmopolitan society. But everyone has to be wedded to the first order, even if your second order doctrine is something else. Islam, Church of England, whatever, just being a secular Brit. These are all second order doctrines that are causing this fragmentation in their society. It's happening in the United States as well. So everybody is picking on liberalism right now. Everybody is making it evil, making it the enemy as a scapegoat. But that is a grievous error, and it's going to send us into a dark age in which we all fight over our patches of soil, our cultures, and we go back to this shitty Bronze Age infighting, frankly.
Well, let's not do that, I guess.
Let's not do that. But I'm getting too heady for the conversation about this event. My hope is that the folks who come will be willing to get heady like that with us, willing to explore, willing to set aside their priors for a moment, whatever they are, in order to play with us intellectually. That is the point of this symposium. And I'm glad that Raven is calling it that. I think that's a really nice term for such a gathering.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's so much to say here. I mean, we could keep going on and on. I think pluralism is. I'm also very connected to this project because of the value of pluralism. I see this idea of first order pluralism is so essential as like a cultural internal value system, because otherwise, we're not going to survive the kind of technological age that we're going through either. I think where I think about the forefront of humanity is where it interacts with new forms of technology. And in this sense, there's bigger existential questions about even what it means to be human. If we have external gestation, if someone else has my child, is this human? You know, if we start to manipulate cells to create, you know, new kinds of creatures, or if we bring together organic material with non-organic material and create xenobots, what is that? Is this natural? Is this artificial? Like, all of these distinctions are becoming more plastic. And in order to cope with that level of plasticity, have to have a structure of, at least where my intellectual path has gone, like there needs to be some architecture of pluralism to hold people, agents, creatures, beings, things, making new stuff out of the plasticity that we've unlocked in this universe that we're playing in. And the potential for some sort of authoritarian monoculture to come in and say, no, this type of experimentation cannot happen. It undermines this, you know, monolithic structure that we believe in. You can't do this anymore. And to use violence to suppress that, it could be like creating a hard fork for humanity in some sense, right? And obviously this is very nuanced territory, which is exactly why I think we need people who are taking these ideas of pluralism, of the plasticity of the world that we live in, of moving into a future that is different than the one that we've had in previous times, of engaging on a cultural level, on a religious level, on a mystical level, rather than just on a political level. Like, all of these things are necessary for being able to cope with what may be an explosion of difference. Like, the difference between two races or two cultures may seem minuscule in 100 years, or maybe not even so much. Like, that we have speciation, you know, as a consequence of our marriage with certain forms of technology, right? So in this sense, it's like being able to understand and to deal and be with difference is critical. To be able to see difference flourish and hold that is a fundamental skill set that I mean, look around.
I mean, 200 and 300 years ago, hell, today in certain parts of the world, but certainly in Europe, 200 and 300 years ago, there was mass bloodshed due to the difference between Catholic and Protestant. That is, you know, that mode of interpretation is bigger in life to an adherent to that sect or to that denomination. But when we look at it from this sort of lens, you know, we're looking back and things seem more 2020 as we look backwards in time, but that seems unnecessary. And it was the rise of the liberals that said religious toleration is the way, guys. You practice your way, they'll practice theirs, and enlarge and expand your communities. But don't fight. It's not hard. This is toleration became a core virtue of society. We saw some throughout history before that. People who managed empires, or early Persian Empire managed that and allowed for a lot of religious self-determination locally. And syncretism was another way where you incorporate their gods into yours in order to make a sort of a unified whole. But these are the processes of peace. And that's really what we're trying to build here. I mean, are the spiritual precursors to a peaceful state of affairs. I don't want to sound like a complete hippie, and I'm certainly willing to defend myself if I'm attacked. And those days may come, but we are working.
Grow your hair out, Max, to be a hippie, to be perceived as a hippie.
Satyagraha. I used to have long hair, but it was from heavy metal, not hippiness.
Ah, there you go. I suspected something like this. There you go. Great. So, okay. Where can people find you? So when is that event taking place? I think it's in mid-September, no? When is it exactly?
Yeah, it's Wednesday, 11th. September 11th.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Where can
Yep, you can find it at grayrobes.substack.com. That's the best place to find us. That is a Substack, and you can buy your tickets by subscribing to the Substack. If you don't want to do that, because you get all the great content associated with the Gray Robes, if you don't want to do that, you can also buy your ticket directly through PayPal.
Great. I really love the idea, to bring all these kinds of different things together, politics and spirituality and art. And so then will there be something like a live stream?
No.
Gotta be there.
We will be recording it, but we won't be live streaming it.
Right. And you plan to do this annually, or is it like a first,
We'll see. Yeah. If we're successful, yeah, for sure. If not, then we have to revisit what went wrong. But hopefully, your listeners will come and make us a success, so we can do more of them.
Right. Great. Wish you best of luck, guys.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you for stopping by.